Lecture 1. The 11th of May 1965. When I announced desk lectures, I gave the title as Metaphysics and the subtitle as Concept and Problems. The subtitle was not chosen without a good deal of thought, as the concept of metaphysics already raises considerable difficulties. And I will tell you straight away that it is my intention first to discuss the concept of metaphysics, and then to talk paradigmatically about specific metaphysical problems. Indeed, it cannot be otherwise. And I shall present these problems in the context in which I have encountered them in my own dialectical work. It can undoubtedly be said that the concept of metaphysics is the vexed question of philosophy. On one hand, philosophy owes its existence to metaphysics. That is to say that metaphysics, if I might first borrow the standard philosophical language, although I may later replace it by something else, deals with the so-called last things on account of which human beings first began to philosophize. On the other hand, however, the situation of metaphysics is such that it is extremely difficult to indicate what its subject matter is. This is not only because the existence of this subject matter is questionable and is even the cardinal problem of metaphysics, but also, even if the existence or non-existence of its subject matter is disregarded, because it is very difficult to say what metaphysics actually is. Today metaphysics is used in almost the entire non-German-speaking world as a term of abuse, a synonym for idle speculation, mere nonsense and heaven knows what other intellectual vices. Disciplines will no doubt already have been told. But, as I said, it is very difficult even to define its subject with any precision. I recall my own early experience as a schoolboy when I first came across Nietzsche, who, as any of you who are familiar with his work will know, is not sparing in his complaints about metaphysics. And I remember how difficult I found it to get my bearings with regard to metaphysics. When I sought the advice of someone considerably older than myself, I was told that it was too early for me to understand metaphysics, but that I would be able to do so one day. Thus, the answer to the question about the subject matter of metaphysics was postponed. That is an accident of biography, but if we look at metaphysical systems or philosophies themselves, we cannot escape the suspicion that what happens in them is not so very different to what was expressed in that piece of advice. I mean that the whole, immeasurable effort of philosophy, which once saw itself as preliminary work to metaphysics, a propedeutic, has become autonomous and has replaced it. Or, when philosophy finally concerns itself with metaphysics itself, we are consoled, as in Kant, too, for example, with endless possible answers to the metaphysical questions. And then, instead of being given an answer to these questions, if I can express it from the standpoint of metaphysics, we are given considerations on whether we have the right to pose those metaphysical questions at all. So that the naive postponement and procrastination that I experience is not really so accidental. It seems to have something to do with the subject matter itself. And especially with the general procedure which philosophy adopts in relation to metaphysics, which still takes the Kantian form of a progressus ad infinitum, an infinite or indefinitely continuing progression of knowledge, from which it is to be hoped that, at a time which will never arrive, the so-called basic metaphysical questions will finally have been resolved. I mentioned Nietzsche. In his work the concept of metaphysics often crops up in the form of a joke, which, however, contains a first approximation of what actually is to be understood by metaphysics. He talks of the hinterworld, the backworld, and calls those who concern themselves with metaphysics, or even practice or teach it, Hinterwäldler, backworldsmen, an allusion to the word backwoodsman commonly used at that time, which, of course, was shortly after the American Civil War. It referred to those living in the backwoods, that darkest province of the Midwest, from which Lincoln, a highly topical figure at that time, had emerged. This word implies that metaphysics is a doctrine which assumes the existence of a world behind the world we know and can know. Behind the world of phenomena there was supposed to be concealed. Here Nietzsche's definition becomes an ironic comment on the Platonic tradition, a truly real, permanent, unchanging world existing in itself, a world of essences, to unravel and reveal which was the task of philosophy. Expressed more objectively, metaphysics was presented as the quintessence of the philosophical theory of all that pertained to the beyond or, to use the specific philosophical term for the realm beyond experience, a science of the transcendental in contradistinction to the sphere of immanence. But at the same time, Nietzsche's term backworld also poured scorn, in the spirit of the nominalist Enlightenment, on the superstition and provinciality which, in his view, automatically adhere to the assumption of such a world behind the world. I think it would be useful, therefore, to reflect for a moment on this doctrine of Nietzsche's, which equated metaphysics ironically, for he well knew, of course, that it is not literally the case, with occultism. Historically, metaphysics not only has nothing to do with occultism, but it would hardly be an exaggeration to say that it has been conceived expressly in opposition to occult thinking, as is quite manifest in one of the greatest thinkers of the modern age who is metaphysical in the specific sense, Leibniz. Admittedly, in genetic terms, with which we shall be concerned repeatedly in the course of our reflections, it is undeniable that metaphysics itself is a phenomenon of the secularization of mythical and magical thinking, so that it is not so absolutely detached from superstitious ideas as it understands itself to be, and as it has presented itself in the history of philosophy. Moreover, it is interesting in this connection that occultist organizations, throughout the world, as far as I am aware, always have a certain tendency to call themselves metaphysical associations or something of that kind. This is interesting in several respects. Firstly, because occultism, that apocryphal and, in higher intellectual society, offensive belief in spirits, gains respectability through association with something bathed in the nimbus of Aristotle, St. Thomas Aquinas and heaven knows who else. But secondly, because the occultists, in calling themselves metaphysicians, have an inkling of a fact profoundly rooted in occultism, that it stands in a certain opposition to theology. They have a sense that the things with which they are concerned, precisely through their opposition to theology, touch on metaphysics rather than theology, which, however, they are equally fond of enlisting as support when it suits them. All the same, one might here quote the statement by one of the test subjects we questioned in our investigations for the authoritarian personality. He declared that he believed in astrology because he did not believe in God. For I shall just mention this fact in passing. I believe this. What can be said at once, however, is that no philosophical metaphysics has ever been concerned with spirits in the sense of existing beings, since metaphysics from the first, that is, from Plato or Aristotle, has protested against and distinguished itself from precisely the idea of something existing in the sense of crude facticity, in the sense of the scattered individual things which Plato calls rheovra. Incidentally, I shall have something to say very soon on the question whether metaphysics began with Plato or with Aristotle. It may be that there are certain metaphysical directions which are called spiritualistic, that of Berkeley, for example, or of Leibniz, although the Leibnizian monad is not so absolutely separate from actual physical existence as has been taught by the neo-Kantian interpretation of Leibniz. But if spiritualistic tendencies exist in philosophy, in metaphysics, and if it has been argued that the Irish Bishop Berkeley, who might be said to have been at the same time an extreme empiricist and an extreme metaphysician, really taught only the reality of spirits, these are not to be understood as spirits in the ordinary sense, but as purely intellectual entities determined by mind alone, on which everything actual is founded. It is not possible to ascribe to them the kind of factual existence with which they are endowed, prior to criticism or even reflection, by occultism and spiritualism in their various guises. I believe, therefore, that you would do well to exclude straight away from metaphysics any such idea of actually existing entities which could be experienced beyond our empirical, spatial-temporal world, or at least to exclude them as far as the philosophical tradition of metaphysics is concerned. Metaphysics, and this may well bring me closer to a definition of what you may understand by that term, always deals with concepts. Metaphysics is the form of philosophy which takes concepts as its objects. And I mean concepts in a strong sense, in which they are almost always given precedence over, and are assigned to a higher order of being than existing things or the facts subsumed under them, and from which the concepts are derived. The controversy on this point, the debate whether concepts are mere signs and abbreviations, or whether they are autonomous, having an essential, substantial being in themselves, has been regarded as one of the great themes of Western metaphysics since Plato and Aristotle. In the form of the famous nominalist dispute, this question preoccupied the Middle Ages and, as I shall show you shortly, seven is almost directly prefigured in conflicting motifs within Aristotle's metaphysics. And because the concept is, of course, an instrument of knowledge, the question of the nature of the concept has from the first been both a metaphysical and an epistemological one. This may help you to understand why, for as long as metaphysics has existed, that is, for as long as concepts have been subjected to reflection, metaphysics has been entwined with problems of logic and epistemology in an extremely curious way, which culminated in Hegel's teaching that logic and metaphysics are really one and the same. 8. Now, by indicating to you how metaphysics stands, on one hand, in relation to the occult and, on the other, to religion, I have arrived at an historical dimension which may have a not unimportant bearing on the concept of metaphysics itself. I should remark in passing that, in my view, one cannot make progress in philosophy with purely verbal definitions, by simply defining concepts. Many of you will have heard this from me ad nauseam, and I ask you to excuse me if I repeat it once more for those to whom I have not yet preached on this subject. I believe that while philosophy may well terminate in definitions, it cannot start out from them, and that, in order to understand, to have knowledge of the content of philosophical concepts themselves, and not simply from the point of view of an external history of ideas or of philosophy, it is necessary to know how concepts have come into being, and what they mean in terms of their origins, their historical dimension. 9. Turning now to this dimension, which interests me especially in this context, it is the case that, historically, the positivist school is expressly contrasted to theology. I refer here to positivism in the form in which it first appeared, as a conception of sociology as the supreme and true science, and, indeed, as the true philosophy. This opposition to religion is explicit in Auguste Comte and implicit in his teacher Saint Simon, even if the terms are not yet used in this way. Both these thinkers develop theories involving stages, a philosophy of history which moves in three great phases. The first of these is the theological phase, the second the metaphysical, and the third the scientific, or, as those thinkers like to call it 150 or 200 years ago, the positive phase. They thereby pointed to something which is essential to metaphysics according to its own concept, and which thus helps to explain what I said to you a few minutes ago, when I stated that metaphysics is essentially concerned with concepts, and with concepts in a strong sense. For according to these positivist theories of stages, both the natural divinities and the god of the monotheists were first secularized, but were then held fast in their turn as something objective, existing in itself, like the old gods earlier. Now, it is interesting to note that the positivists were especially ill-disposed towards metaphysics, because it had to do with concepts and not with facts, whereas the positive theologies had described their deities as factual, existent beings. And accordingly, in the writings of the positivists you will find more invective against metaphysics than against theology. This applies especially to Auguste Comte who, in his late phase, had the delusive idea of turning science itself into a kind of cult, something like a positive religion. It must be added, nevertheless, that metaphysics is often associated with theology in popular consciousness, and there are doubtless more than a few among you who tend to draw no very sharp distinction between the concepts of theology and metaphysics, and to lump them together under the general heading of transcendence. But now that we have to concern ourselves specifically with these concepts, I should like to invite you, if you still approach these questions with a certain naivety, to differentiate, and of course, progress in philosophical thinking is, in general, essentially progress in differentiation. I believe it can be stated more or less as a dogma that philosophical insight is more fruitful the more it is able to differentiate within its subject matter, and that the undifferentiating approach which measures everything by the same yardstick actually embodies precisely the course and, if I might put it like this, the uneducated mentality which philosophy, in its subjective, pedagogical role, is supposed to overcome or, as I'd prefer to say, to eliminate. Now it is certainly true that metaphysics has something in common with theology in its manner of seeking to elevate itself above immanence, above the empirical world. To put it somewhat more crudely, the widespread equating of metaphysics and theology, which comes about if one fails to reflect expressly on these concepts, can be traced back simply to something which pre-exists and predominates in the mental formation of all of us, even if we are not directly aware of it. It is the fact that the teachings of the Catholic Church are indissolubly linked to metaphysical speculation, and in particular, as you all must know, to Aristotelian speculation in the form in which it was passed down through the great Arabian philosophers to those of the High Middle Ages, and above all to St. Thomas Aquinas. 1 2 But even that is not so simple. And you may gain an idea of the tension between metaphysics and theology that I have referred to, if you consider that at the time of the rise of Christianity in late antiquity, when Christianity was introduced as the state religion even in Athens, the schools of philosophy still existing there, which we should call metaphysical schools, were closed and suppressed with great brutality. 13 And, I would remark in passing, precisely the same thing was repeated in the great theological reaction of Islam against the Aristotelian Islamic philosophers, although this happened at a time when the metaphysical heritage, mediated through the Islamic philosophers, had already won its place in Christian Europe. In late antiquity, therefore, metaphysics was regarded as something specifically subversive with regard to Christianity. And the fanatical Islamic monks who drove the philosophers into exile regarded it in a very similar way. The reason why they took this attitude may well show up very clearly the differences I should like to establish between metaphysics and theology. It is quite certain that metaphysics and theology cannot simply be distinguished from each other as historical stages, as the positivists try to do, since they have constantly overlapped historically. One appeared at the same time as the other, one was forgotten, only to re-emerge in the foreground. They form an extraordinarily complex structure which cannot be reduced to a simple conceptual formula. Nevertheless, there is an element of truth in the theory of stages that I refer to, in that metaphysics in the traditional sense, and we have to start from the traditional concept. If I am to make clear to you what metaphysics really means, is an attempt to determine the absolute, or the constitutive structures of being, on the basis of thought alone. That is, it does not derive the absolute dogmatically from revelation, or as something positive which is simply given to me, as something directly existing, through revelation or recorded revelation, but, to repeat the point, it determines the absolute through concepts. and to say this is really to pose the fundamental problem of metaphysics, which has accompanied it throughout its history, and which also confronted it in, for example, the critique of metaphysics by Kant, as it presented itself to him at that time, in the guise of the Leibniz-Wolffian school. It is the problem that thought, which in its conditionality is supposed to be sufficient to have knowledge only of the conditional, presumes to be the mouthpiece, or even the origin, of the unconditional. This problem, which manifested itself in the violent reaction of theologies against metaphysics earlier, points at the same time to one of the core problems, if not to the core problem, of metaphysics. Thought, it might be said, has within it the tendency to disintegrate traditional, dogmatic ideas. It has that tendency even in Socrates, who taught what Kant would have called a metaphysics of morals, and who is regarded as having disintegrated the traditional state religion. This explains the occasional alliances between positivism and positive religion against metaphysics, against the disintegrating force which they both detected in it. Autonomous thought is a mouthpiece of the transcendent, and is thus always in danger, when it approaches the transcendent through metaphysics, of making common cause with it. And I believe it is a characteristic which can be ascribed, in a perhaps hasty but not unfounded generalization, at least to all the traditional metaphysical systems known to me, that while these systems have always been critically disposed towards anything they regarded as dogmatic or fixed ideas, they have attempted, on the other hand, to rescue, on the basis of thought alone, that to which the dogmatic or transcendent ideas referred. This tension runs through the whole of metaphysical thinking, and I shall have occasion to define it very precisely for you using the example of Aristotle. If metaphysics and theology did finally come to an agreement, it was an alliance roughly comparable, if you will allow me the sociological language, to that between feudalism and bourgeois forces which can be observed at certain times in more recent history. Both find themselves confronted by a common foe, whether it be the radical, Enlightenment thinking of positivism, or, on occasion, materialism, as precipitated to a greater or lesser degree in Marchand theories, for example, whether those theories were rightly or wrongly understood. It is probably characteristic only of present-day metaphysics that it has relinquished its opposition to theology, while theology only felt obliged to assimilate metaphysics at a stage when the bourgeoisie was relatively advanced, at the high point of the urban culture of the Middle Ages. It did so in order to justify itself apologetically before the mature consciousness of the urban bourgeois, who wanted to know how the revealed wisdom stood in relation to their own developed and emancipated reason. The Thomist system is a grandiose attempt to derive this justification of revelation from metaphysics, while that of Duns Scotus is an almost desperate onk. At any rate, the first point I would ask you to note 14 is that metaphysical systems in the precise sense are doctrines according to which concepts form a kind of objective, constitutive support on which what is naively called an objective world, that is, scattered, individual, existing things, is founded and finally depends. You may recall that I pointed out earlier in today's lecture that the question whether concepts are real or are merely signs, that is, the dispute between nominalism and realism, is itself carried on within metaphysical inquiry, just as, originally, the realists and the nominalists were not opposed schools of metaphysicians and anti-metaphysicians respectively. Rather, these two schools, both in Islam and in medical philosophy, were schools which arose and fought each other within metaphysical thinking. This reveals something which is important if you want to avoid confusion in thinking about the concept of metaphysics. This concept has undergone a certain formalization which can also be seen as a part of its disintegration, in that the mere treatment of metaphysical questions, regardless of the outcome, is now treated as metaphysics, and not just positive teachings about concepts as entities existing in themselves. Both things, therefore, the doctrine of the back-world and the doctrine which repudiates this back-world, would fall equally, and dubiously, within the field of metaphysical problems, according to this formalized or generalized concept. I say dubiously because there is a temptation here to draw a false conclusion which is constantly encountered in the field of vulgar apologetics. Whether one is for metaphysics or against metaphysics, both positions are metaphysical, both depend on ultimate positions about which it is not possible to argue, whereas the nature and operation of concepts lie precisely in the fact that it is entirely possible to argue about them, and that, in general, if the anti-metaphysical position is subsumed under the concept of metaphysics, it is deprived of its critical edge, its polemical or dialectical potency. Thus, one speaks formally, for example, of metaphysical materialism, in which matter is designated as the ultimate ground of being, as the truly existent, as was once the case in the thought of Leucippus and Democritus. You can observe similar things in present-day theology, where, if anything is said about the name of God and his existence or non-existence, there is much rejoicing over the fact that God is mentioned at all, regardless of whether the speaker is for or against God. This, I would think, is enough to indicate that the present time, to put it cautiously, is unlikely to be the most propitious for the building of cathedrals. On the other hand, it is the cask. One should add for the sake of justice that in the thought of such carly so-called anti-metaphysicians and materialists as Chrysippus and Democritus, the structure of the metaphysical, of the absolute and final ground of explanation, is nevertheless preserved within their materialistic thought. If one calls these materialists metaphysical materialists, because matter for them is the ultimate ground of being, one does not entirely miss the mark. But this designation already contains a critical moment with regard to these early philosophers, a moment which led in the course of further reflection to a critique of what they taught. The 13th of May 19651. Link. This formalization too is expressed in the formal character of the usual definitions. The usual definition is, for example, the ultimate ground or cause of existing things. According to this, with the scientification of philosophy, metaphysics is supposed to be the fundamental science. Metaphysics seen accordingly as the doctrine of primary being, of Imperiovala. 3. The ambiguity of this, primary for us, or in itself. Yet there are also doctrines, like some Gnostic teachings, 4, or that of the late Schiller on the divinity as a becoming, 5, and some speculations of Schelling, 6, which, again, do not conform to this concept. 7. For example, metaphysics as the doctrine of the abiding does not necessarily coincide with the concept of metaphysics. While I can mention themes of metaphysics, such as being, ground of being, nothingness, God, freedom, immortality, becoming, truth, spirit, insertion to. While most metaphysics seeks invariance, its subjects vary. For example, the concept of force is hardly discussed in it today, likewise that of life. One speaks of fashions, but the so-called fashions of philosophy are indices of something deeper. Demonstrate by the example of life. Parallelism, and the question of their possible reciprocal influence, has receded remarkably, probably under the influence of the doctrine of the subjective constitution of the physical world, in both Kant and the empiricists, whereas, if this doctrine is invalidated, the problem of the so-called parallelism can emerge again, and actually did recur in Kohler's extended theory of Gestalt. 10. There is an emergence and a forgetting, hardly a resolution, of metaphysical questions. Also their re-emergence in the sense of correspondences within the philosophy of history. 11. 13.5.65. The 18th of May 1965. While I can mention subjects of metaphysics, such as being, ground of being, nothingness, God, freedom, immortality, becoming, truth, spirit, their full concept, like any strong concept, cannot be given in a verbal definition but only presented through a concrete treatment of the constellation of problems which forms the concept of metaphysics. In the second part of the lecture I shall give you models of these. Decisive for an understanding of philosophical concepts, the history of terminology. The concept of metaphysics goes back to Aristotle, and specifically to the arrangement of the Corpus Aristotelicum by Andronicus of Rhodes, 50-60 NC, in the 1st century before Christ, in which the main work of Aristotle devoted to that area, where Erekoika, was placed after the Physics. Insertion to. As early as the Neoplatonists, this name, with its technical implications for editing, was interpreted in terms of content, metata ad volca equals that which goes beyond nature, or, precisely, what is behind nature as its cause. Ontology equals theory of being and of existing things, the nature of the world of human beings' existence and nature of the divinity. Echoes of this in Kant, whose themes were prescribed by precisely what he criticized. This is good in that he does not think indiscriminately, and bad through its inhomogeneity with regard to his own nominalist assumptions. Distinction between speculative and inductive metaphysics. All these are specifically dogmatic categories, relating to a prescribed and positively teachable area of subject matter, that is, they aim at a merging of theology and metaphysics. But as the subject matter is itself problematic and no such doctrine can be advocated, I mention these categories, the pedantry of which makes a mockery of the subject, so that you are aware of them, without going into them further. A similarly traditional distinction is drawn between deductive and inductive metaphysics. Inductive metaphysics, an artificially devised auxiliary concept intended to prop up a collapsed structure by adapting it to the very thing which has disintegrated it. Like relatively increasing misery? Inductive equals empirical equals scientific. Experience is therefore to be used to justify what transcends it. Heidegger's approach of analyzing Dasein to gain access to ontology has similarities. Something as apparently open to experience as Dasein, that is essentially the experience of the individual subject of himself, is supposed to give insight into the nature of being, despite the limits and randomness of this experience. Of course, this presupposes the metaphysical privilege of the human being, who defines himself in calling Dasein the ontic, which at the same time is ontological, and is therefore transparent, qua consciousness, with regard to its constituents. 3. However easy it is to point out the contradictions in an inductive metaphysics, that alone is no objection, unless one simply eliminates the contradiction in the way customary in science. There is, in fact, a concept of metaphysical experience, though not one which can be grasped by the usual means of induction or with reference to a self-revealing ontology. Perhaps, to begin with, simply a reluctance to accept the accepted. For example, Luderbach, dead animals. For why is the bank called a bank? The entwinement of metaphysics with thought, inaugurated so emphatically by Aristotle in opposing hylozoism, 7 is eradicable. One can indeed say now that metaphysics began with Aristotle. Bibliography here. 8. The 18th of May 65. The 25th of May 1965. I closed my last lecture by putting forward the thesis that, in a precise sense, metaphysics began with Aristotle. This is a rather shocking thesis, although the shock will be somewhat less severe if one reflects that Greek speculation has a long prehistory in which it largely emancipated itself from hylozoism, with its rather crude reflections on nature. Here I shall mention only the names of Heraclitus, Parmenides, and above all, of course, Plato. If I now attempt to substantiate this thesis somewhat further, it is not in order to indulge in witty paradoxes, but because I believe it will enable me to say something not unimportant about the concept of metaphysics itself. You will recall the definitions of metaphysics I gave earlier. They were not really definitions in the strict sense, but a series of thematic indications and propositions intended to show you roughly what the concerns of metaphysics are. Among these indications, the question of true being, of the one, the essential, played a major part. The Platonic doctrine of ideas does indeed have to do with these concepts, and I assume you are all more or less familiar with it. The ideas, that is, hypostatized universal concepts, as they are commonly called, are regarded by Plato, in contrast to scattered multiplicity, as the true, the one, the essential, and, above all, as the cause of all appearances. This definition, really a definition of metaphysics itself, which deals with the causes of all things, was taken over in Aristotle's Metaphysics and elevated to the definition of metaphysical questions. According to Plato, only the forms of things have true and original being. And these forms, this is the subject of the famous dispute he had with Antisthenes too, are not merely the abstract attributes of diverse individual things. They are themselves, both logically and genetically, what is primary in individual things. For this reason they are called eidos or idea, as that which is being in itself and is open to seeing, as is implied in the parable of the cave. Both words eidos, essence, and idea, our word for idea, contain the stem 8, phys, which relates to the visual, the optical, to seeing. To this extent, therefore, in terms of his themes, Plato could be regarded as the arch-metaphysician, the metaphysician per se, and perhaps he may indeed be counted as such. But in Plato, and this is the crucial point, which brings us a good deal closer to the meaning of the term metaphysics. The world of the senses is described as that which is absolutely without being, although he was no more able than the Eleatics before him to sustain this position rigorously. For him, the world of appearances really does not exist in any strong sense. And it can be said, if you will allow me to put it rather drastically, just to point out the main landmarks in this discussion, that Plato's philosophy is a synthesis of elitism, especially Parmenides, and Heraclitus. From Parmenides he took the doctrine of being as the one, the absolutely indivisible and imperishable, and from Heraclitus the doctrine of the absolute transitoriness of appearance, which exists in a state of constant flux and, moreover, is deceptive and unreliable, as is shown above all in Plato's relatively late dialogue Theaetetus. His fundamental attitude, which has had a profound and lasting influence on later Western philosophy and constantly reemerges in different forms, lies in the emphasis on deception, on the illusoriness of sense data. Even in a philosopher as nominalist as John Locke, this thesis recurs in the distinction between the primary qualities, which are attributes of things in themselves, and the merely subjective, secondary qualities. Plus, no word is needed, although in the history of philosophy many have been used, to make one aware that this drastic separation of the idea from the world of the senses is very difficult to maintain. In Plato it implies the doctrine of the non-being of the sensible, of PV. It can be convincingly demonstrated that the qualities appropriated by the ideas, in becoming that which is being in itself, are in reality taken over more or less directly from the world of appearances, and that the absolute status of the idea is attained, as it were, at the expense of the world of the senses from which it is derived. Plato himself was by no means consistent in this respect. For example, in describing the idea as the cause of all being and of all existing things, and locating the idea in a realm of absolute origins, as opposed to the realm of things which have originated in it, he implies that there must be something else, precisely that which is originated. Or take another very famous theorem of Plato's, the doctrine of Pudicius, of the participation of the scattered things in the idea to which they are subordinate. This also presupposes something different from the idea. If there were nothing which was different from the idea, such a participation in the idea, such a aegis, would not be possible. And in fact, the late Plato did extensively revise the strict version of the doctrine of ideas, as it appears in what are called the classical, middle dialogues. I would mention here the very curious dialogue from Plato's late period, which has given rise to innumerable difficulties and bears the name Parmenides. Naturally, you should not confuse this with the Eleatic Parmenides, although he is the protagonist and victor in this dialogue. In it Plato puts forward what might be seen as the implicitly very dialectical thesis that, however little the many amount to without the one, the many refers to the scattered things, as opposed to the one idea under which each thing in a genus is subsumed, however little this many may be without the one, without its idea, just as little as the one, the idea, without the many. 6. There is no doubt that in Plato's late period the existent asserts itself increasingly against the idea, although, in the chronology of Plato's works, which is now generally accepted, one of the dialogues in which the doctrine of ideas is presented most bluntly and developed most ingeniously, the Phaedrus, is dated extremely late. This dating does, of course, make the development of Plato that I have referred to, towards what might be called a greater acknowledgement of the empirical, somewhat precarious. However, despite the protests of dyed-in-the-wool Platonists, I should like to assume such a development, and I would also mention that in the Anglo-Saxon countries, where there is a very strong culture in the interpretation of classical Greek texts, one not infrequently comes across the hypothesis that Plato as an old man was influenced retrospectively by his pupil Aristotle, or that, as a result of his political disappointments in his attempts to set up the world purely on the basis of the idea, he was forced to give greater recognition to that which is, the scattered, the merely existent. If one reviews the development of the great classical work on politics, the Politia, through the statesmen to the last work, the laws, there is much evidence to suggest that that is the case. But I am only mentioning this to show you how complex these relationships are. Incidentally, you would all do well, before embarking on these very complex problems that I can only sketch for you here, to look at Goethe's famous descriptions of the two philosophers, whom he saw as antithetical, Plato and Aristotle. He contrasted what today would be vulgarly called the idealist Plato to the realist Aristotle, who, as Goethe put it, had his feet planted firmly on the earth. 7. After what I have just said, my assertion that metaphysics really began with Aristotle will be doubly shocking because the importance Plato seems to attach to the higher world, to transcendence, as against the world itself, appears to make him far more metaphysical than his pupil Aristotle. But I believe we have arrived here at the central, problematic point from which you will be best able to understand what metaphysics really means. For even if we concede that Plato gave much greater weight, nolens, to the world of Arov, or non-being, to the world of sensible experience, than he should have done according to the strict doctrine of ideas, and even if we concede further that this tendency in Plato grew stronger in the course of his long life, one thing is quite definitely lacking in his work: reflection on how these two spheres, of direct experience and of the idea, the concept, the one, or whatever you like to call it, are related to each other. It might be best to say that while the traditional problems of metaphysics present themselves in the structure of the Platonic doctrine of ideas, they do so, as it were, objectively, without being reflected thematically in his philosophy. While it is true that the tension between the sphere of transcendence and the sphere of that which is merely the case, between ro ov and ro ovra, is present in Plato's philosophy, because it is unavoidable, breaking through again and again, his philosophy is not constituted in such a way that this tension is central to his speculation. Now, what I should really like to make understandable to you is that the sphere of metaphysics in the precise sense only comes into being where this tension is itself the subject of philosophy, where it comes within the purview of thought. It might be said, therefore, that metaphysics arises at the point where the empirical world is taken seriously, and where its relation to the supersensible world, which was hitherto taken for granted, is subjected to reflection. It is possible to imagine the Platonic doctrine of ideas, without doing it too much violence, as a secularization of theology. The Platonic ideas have been called the gods turned into concepts, and one would scarcely disagree, just as the supreme idea, the idea of the good or of justice, is frequently referred to in Plato as Dios, probably in direct continuation of a Socratic tradition. But the problem posed by this secularization is that once the gods are turned into concepts, that is, entities of appearance, their relationship to appearances becomes something quite other than if the gods were simply located in the beyond, on their Olympus. This problem emerges again and again in the epistemological and logical difficulties with which Plato has to contend. But, if I might put it thus, he was naively theological in failing to draw from the secularization of the gods into concepts, which he had brought about, the conclusion that the relation of the concept or the idea to the world of appearances was thereby radically changed, and made problematic. One might define metaphysics as the product of a breach between the senses, the gods secularized as ideas, and the phenomenal world, a breach which is inevitable as soon as the gods become concepts and being becomes a relation to existing things. At the same time, however, these two moments cannot be naively related together or formulated concurrently. I believe this way of stating the matter may better define the locus of metaphysics in the history of philosophy, and thus define the essence of metaphysics as well, than would be possible in the relatively superficial lectures one might give on the themes of metaphysics. Following from this definition, one might say that metaphysics, because it attempts to regard the ideas as something linked to the empirical world but endangered by advancing secularization, was itself threatened from the first in its own development. In this connection, it is certainly no accident that nominalism, the radically rationalistic view which denied any autonomous existence to ideas, based itself precisely on Aristotle, and did so twice over, both in Arabian philosophy and in scholasticism, although, as cannot be emphasized too much, Aristotle himself, as you will find out, was anything but a nominalist. When Heidegger refers to metaphysics as a kind of rationalistic decline from the original understanding of being an archaic philosophy, I cannot entirely disagree, from a strictly phenomenological viewpoint, with his characterization. On one hand, metaphysics is always, if you will, rationalistic as a critique of a conception of true, essential being in itself which does not justify itself before reason. But, on the other, it is always also an attempt to rescue something which the philosopher's genius feels to be fading and vanishing. There's in fact no metaphysics, or very little, which is not an attempt to save, and to save by means of concepts, what appeared at the time to be threatened precisely by concepts, and was in the process of being disintegrated, or corroded, to use the more effective language of the ancient anti-sophists. Metaphysics is thus, one might say, something fundamentally modern, if you do not restrict the concept of modernity to our world but extend it to include Greek history. And it is no accident that metaphysics re-emerges in the High Middle Ages, a period of urban bourgeois culture in which the naive immediacy of Christian faith was already breaking down, and then a second time in the broad movement of thought which is generally embraced by terms such as the Renaissance, the Reformation and humanism. Aristotle, in the first truly metaphysical work of literature, the one which gave that branch of philosophy its name, criticizes the Platonic attempt to oppose essence to the world of the senses, as something separate and absolutely different from it. Above all, he criticizes the Platonic hypostasis of universal concepts as a duplication of the world. In this he makes a very strong and legitimate case, based on the argument that all the attributes of the ideas are derived from the empirical world, on which they live, rather as the rulers live on the work of their servants or slaves. At the same time, however, he then seeks in his turn to extract an essential being from the sensible, empirical world, and thereby to save it. And it is precisely this twofold aim of criticism and rescue which constitutes the nature of metaphysics. The polarity between critical rationality, on the one hand, and the pathos of rescue, on the other, points to the essence of traditional metaphysics, or at least has done so throughout its history. Metaphysics can thus be defined as the exertion of thought to save what at the same time it destroys. That this formulation is tenable, and not arbitrary, is indicated, I believe, by the fact that the very same structure which I have demonstrated to you in principle by the example of Aristotle's metaphysics, or as a precondition of that work, is also characteristic of Kant's position with regard to the problem of metaphysics. Although Kant, in upholding a blunt, unreconciled dualism, undoubtedly has more in common with the philosophical climate of Plato than of Aristotle, and the Critique of Pure Reason contains, in the introduction to the section on the ideas, the finest pages ever written about Plato. 10 pages I would most strongly urge all of you to read. It can be said that in this double intention of critique and rescue Kant was closer to Aristotle, whom he did not particularly like, than to Plato. 11. If you will take this historical philosophical interpretation on trust for the time being, you will perhaps understand why I consider it necessary, for a correct understanding of the concept of metaphysics, to begin with an overview of the main theoretical motifs of Aristotle's work. This does require you, however, to take some account of his historical position, for only this will allow you to picture more concretely what I have in mind. This task is made more difficult today, in philosophy, not in classical philology, by the influence of Heidegger and his school, although he recognized very clearly the rationalist, Enlightenment moment in Aristotle. Heidegger attempted to rediscover a much more pristine Aristotle, to an extent which is hard to conceive. And before going on to Aristotle, I think I need to offer a brief critique of this approach. I'd like to do this by examining closely a very specific piece of interpretation, since I believe that such things are more clearly revealed by concrete details, rather than by remaining on the level of general assertion. I am concerned here with the first sentence of Aristotle's Metaphysics, and I shall consider only this one sentence. I shall write this sentence in Greek on the blackboard. I am aware that many of you do not know Greek, but there is no other way to proceed. and I shall explain everything you need to know in order to understand it. The sentence is as follows. Point 1-2 According to the generally accepted translations, this means, people by nature strive after knowledge. A well-known translation renders it as, all men by their very nature feel the urge to know. Single quote 13 This sentence is reproduced in Heidegger's Being and Time. Heidegger's version, which, incidentally, is presented cautiously, not as a direct translation, is as follows. The treatise which stands first in the collection of Aristotle's treatises on ontology begins with the sentence. The care for seeing is essential to man's being. It is not my purpose here to poke fun at the stiltedness of this passage, for a mannered, estringing approach to a strange text can have a very salutary function. And I'd like to say at once that Heidegger offers resistance to the flattening out of Greek texts when rendered into our language, as has traditionally been done. However, his interpretation here does not produce simply the salutary alienation effect I refer to, but violates the meaning on the most literal level. When he says, for example, man's being, 14 The human being is already put in the singular, presupposing a priority of the essence of the human being, and thus a kind of anthropological ontology, which in Aristotle is still to be established. 15 Aristotle does not say the human being, or existence as such, but simply and plainly all people, the people, and not individual people, for 11 means quite simply to know, and means, people earnestly seek or strive after knowledge. Now it is undoubtedly correct, as I had occasion to indicate to you earlier, 16 that this Eldavar contains the stem flis, which is also in law ea and which characterizes the sensory relationship of seeing. But in his interpretation Heidegger simply suppresses the whole history of language which, starting from the rich, sensible conceptions originally associated with words, progressively sublimated the words into concepts. This happened in Greek just as it has happened in our language. There can be no doubt that at the stage when Aristotle wrote, Eldavar already meant to know in the sense of a consciousness emancipated from the sensible present. But because ontology, which in Aristotle is only a theme for discussion, is, as I have said, presupposed by Heidegger in an act of repristination, consciousness is supposed to have a direct sensible perception of essence, or being, or whatever it may be, as if it were something existing in itself. And so Heidegger translates this Eldavar back to its much earlier lineage as sensible presence, although by this stage it had entirely lost that quality. He then says that the care of seeing is essential to man's being. Here it becomes blatantly clear what Heidegger is up to. Anyone even slightly acquainted with the history of ancient philosophy and having the rudiments of Greek will know that the word quote is a philosophical term which, about 100 years before Aristotle, I cannot give you the exact date, played a part in Socraticism and Sophism. In opposition to Jager, as that which is so be nature, as against what is merely posited, what is Jaget. The term for essential would be quite different, perhaps vrws or rose v, as it appears in Plato, but quite certainly not, since there is in an echo of and thus a memory of physical nature from the old Hylozoistic period. So the sentence means quite simply, very much in keeping with the mentality of Aristotle, who was a peculiar mixture of an ontologist and a professor of physics, that human beings, as they are, strive by nature for knowledge. But as for the idea that this was meant in the sense 17 of some definite ontological pre-structuring of existence in which being was to be revealed, no shadow of that is to be found in Aristotle. Finally, the word opikovat means no more than to exert oneself, to long for, to strive after something, and has not the slightest connection with care, which, as we know, is one of the core categories in Heidegger. On the contrary, the straightforward love of wisdom has had foisted on it an existential interpretation that it harbors the care of design for its being, although, as you will see in any dictionary, no philology or linguistic knowledge can produce a link between this apair and the concept of care. In examining this sentence in some depth I believe I have shown you what I wanted to develop as the main idea of this lecture, that Aristotle starts out from an everyday, rational, sensible consciousness and attempts, by reflecting on what is given directly by the senses, to attain insight into true being, instead of presupposing this essential realm, as was the case in archaic thought. If that were not the case, if this sentence were as Heidegger interprets it, then Aristotle would not really be a metaphysician, but precisely the ontologist which, in a different place, Heidegger says he is not. 19 But the moment of tension in metaphysics is located exactly in this seemingly straightforward, empirical sentence, in which, however, the striving for knowledge and thus, objectively, for absolute truth, is posited as a need, so that here, too, everything is finally constituted from the point of view of truth. And this really defines quite clearly the intellectual climate within which Aristotle's metaphysics has its place. In the next lecture it will be time to tell you something about the content of the Metaphysics. The 1st of June 1965. I shall start today by presenting to you, as best I can, some of the main ideas in Aristotle's metaphysics. This will lead on to some reflections on the problem of metaphysics in general. I shall base my exposition mainly on the account given by Edward Zeller, although I am well aware that, with regard to philological details, scholarship on Aristotle has made extraordinary progress since the time of Zeller's work. I should like to take this opportunity to say, however, that much of this detailed progress seems to me to have been at the expense of philosophical vision, which was available to Zeller as a member of the Hegelian school to a degree which has subsequently been entirely lost. I therefore prefer the overview and insight he gives us in his book to a possibly greater accuracy of detail, as I am more concerned to throw light on the problems and history of metaphysics through Aristotle than to give you an irreproachably punctilious account of that philosopher's work. The definition of metaphysics is to be found in the first book. Book 8 agrees with what I have already told you about the themes of metaphysics, too, even though its subject matter is somewhat narrower than the diversity of themes we are accustomed to associate with that term. The book states that metaphysics is the sense of first principles and causes. One is struck first, of course, by the link with the Platonic doctrine of ideas, which likewise promises to deal with the first principles, the highest concepts, the causes of phenomena. The first complex which can be extracted from Aristotle's work Metaphysics 4 and which is fundamental to all the rest, I'm expressly following Zeller in this, is the complex of the particular and the universal, which can be said to be really the basic theme of Aristotelian metaphysics. And I should point out to you straight away that in the case of Aristotle, unlike that of Plato, one can talk of a system, to the extent that the methodological and, above all, the epistemological considerations we are accustomed to summarize under the title of the organon are so closely bound up with the argumentation of the metaphysics that some of the main arguments of the latter work go back to these methodological writings, the organon. In particular, they go back within this methodological corpus to the work on the categories. I shall only touch on the fact that categories in Aristotle means something quite different than it does in Kant, namely the basic forms which are brought to light by an analysis of the procedures of speech, and not the basic subjective forms of thought. I assume that most of you are aware of this. 5 and starting from the problem of the particular and the universal in Aristotle, I am following up something I set out in the last lecture, the idea that metaphysics in general has the dual character of the critical or, as is often said, the destructive, and of the apologetic and rescuing. And you will see that this characterization applies in an exceptional degree to Aristotle. It can be said that his treatise, I mean his deliberations, since they were not contained in a separate treatise, his deliberations on the problem of the particular and the universal, fall initially within the sphere of his critical work. However, the accent here is on initially, and this gives rise to a problem with which the whole of Aristotle's metaphysics confronts us. The first thesis, it might be said, is that the universal is not substantial, that it is not, like the Platonic ideas, which are universal concepts, something existing in and for itself, independently of its realization. Rather, one can only speak of a universal to the extent that it manifests itself in a particular. In other words, reflection on the process of abstraction has much more force in Aristotle's deliberations on the universal than it had in Plato, but does not go so far as to conceive universal concepts as pure abstractions. Rather, the difficulty and, if I might put it thus, the point of Aristotle's metaphysics is that while, on the one hand, one cannot think of the universal independently of that in which it is concretized, on the other hand, it is not a mere abstraction in relation to the particulars subsumed under it. If you can picture the problem in this accentuated form, I believe you will be able to cope with the difficulties of this theory straight away. In general, one can only deal with difficulties by looking them in the eye. And Aristotle does make things rather difficult for us by presenting himself as a commonsensical type of thinker in whose work, as in that of a number of British thinkers later, the most unfathomable problems appear initially as if they could yield self-evident answers to simple human understanding, whereas in reality they conceal abysses. I touch here on the specific difficulty presented by an interpretation of Aristotle as a whole. Let me return now to what I indicated at the outset, that I should like to relate my exposition of Aristotle to the history and overall themes of Western metaphysics. It can be said that his doctrine that the universal is not a substantial moment contains the seeds of what is called nominalism, which holds that universal concepts exist post-rem and not ante-rem. But, and I say this to exclude all misunderstandings from the outset, it would be a grave misunderstanding to describe Aristotle himself as a nominalist. I could say that his metaphysics circles around this theme, that its problem lies precisely in the contradictory situation whereby on one hand the universal is denied substantiality while, on the other, universal concepts are not mere abbreviations of the particulars subsumed under them, rather, they have an attribute which raises them above flatus vocis, above the mere breath of the voice. And if you want to understand the concept of metaphysics, you must pay attention from the first to this constellation of moments in Aristotle's metaphysics. He says that, in contrast to the universal, only the particular is substantial, that only the single, apparent, concrete phenomenon is real. This concept of reality, or, better, this concept of the substantial in his work, is denoted by the noun ovola, from which the Latin term for substance is derived, 6, and which itself is derived from elevate, to be. This primary being constitutes, from this perspective, the quintessential theme of Aristotle's work. Only the particular shall, to begin with, be such an ovoia. Only it shall be real. This takes us to the second basic thesis of Aristotle's metaphysics concerning the relationship of universal to particular, the thesis of essence, or, as Plato would say, the idea does not lie outside the things whose essence it is, but is only in so far as it is in things themselves. In other words, Plato's basic doctrine, concerning the xwpropos of the ideas as against the existent, the abyss of meaning which separates the ideas or the universal concepts from the concrete individual things subsumed by them, is challenged by Aristotle. And his approach has what looks like a thoroughly progressive and modern moment in stating that, if I separate the ideas completely from everything existent and make them absolutely autonomous, I turn them into an existent of a second power, of a second, higher order. In modern terms we would say that I objectify or reify the ideas. And from this he derived the entirely plausible objection that the whole world would then be duplicated. On one hand there would be a world which is mere appearance, and on the other a world which is being in itself, but which borrows all its qualities from the empirical world, so that it reappears in the latter, from which issue all kinds of logical conundrums. I shall point out in passing that exactly the same problem makes itself felt in modern epistemology and metaphysics, as when Husserl posits a region of pure senses, of, shall we say, immanent consciousness, and a region comprising the highest unity of psychological determination. This would give rise to a double world, on one side a highly formalized psychology and on the other a doctrine of pure senses, of the forms of consciousness. Finally, if the ideas are presented as absolutely spes, absolutely separate, as was the case in Plato, this gives rise to a second inconsistency of which Aristotle accuses Plato, and which forms the pivot of his own metaphysics. It then becomes inconceivable how, as Plato taught and as Aristotle himself teaches with even greater emphasis, the universal, the ideas, could have any motive force, or how far they could be the causes of their own appearances. For they are said to be absolutely separate from precisely the phenomena world they are supposed to move. And when we are faced by such a division, by the positing of two absolutely different spheres, one of which, for the sake of brevity, we shall call the ontological and the other the ontic, the sphere of existing things, it is simply impossible to conceive how one might interact with the other. As Plato, and Aristotle again demonstrates this with great critical acuity, steadfastly teaches. This problem, too, how it is possible for a pure idea to be an efficient force acting on phenomena, has cropped up throughout the entire history of philosophy. I should like to illustrate it by the example of Kant's critique of practical reason. The problem with which this work of moral philosophy grapples above all is how the moral law, which is something purely spiritual, arising from the intelligible world and independent of any empirical determination, manages to act upon the empirical world, as a compulsion or duty to act in accordance with the ideas. 8. If you look at the critique of practical reason from this point of view, you will see that Kant took enormous pains in trying to resolve this question, and that he was only finally able to do so by the complete intellectualization of the will. So that even those acts which affect the empirical world through the pure ideas are conceived as purely intellectual acts. Kant fails here to realize that if these acts are purely intellectual, one cannot really understand how they could become objective, how they could objectify themselves at all in the world of phenomena. This problem, therefore, which can be leveled as criticism against Kant's metaphysics of morals, is already fully contained in Aristotle's metaphysics, in the form of his realization that if the ideas or universal concepts are absolutely spes, that is, a realm of autonomous essence, it is impossible to conceive how and how far they can be causes of phenomena. Now, the argument for the thesis of the substantiality of the particular, which I mentioned to you, is that nothing which is predicated on some other, underlying thing can be substantial. That is, only that is substantial which does not need something else in order to exist. And with regard to the ovola, in the sense of particular things, he now argues, somewhat curiously, that this characteristic, that we do not need anything else in order to recognize it, is possessed only by particular things. This version of the concept of substance is a fundamental thesis of Western metaphysics. It holds that the substantial is that which needs nothing else in order to exist. This tenet has been handed down by scholasticism and, remarkably, reappears in the philosophy of Descartes. As Coeur has shown, Descartes' philosophy is linked to scholasticism to an extraordinary degree, far more extensively than one would expect, given Descartes' polemical attitude towards his educators. Yet this concept of substance recurs in the Principia, in the famous formulation that substance is that quod nullere indiget ad existendum, 10, that is, which needs no other thing in order to exist. And if you will permit me a brief historical aside, This interpretation of substance, as that which needs nothing else in order to exist, has survived throughout the entire history of philosophy. Not only is this definition of the concept of substance to be found among Spinoza's famous definitions in the Ethics, 11 for example, but it even re-emerges in modern philosophy, in Husserl's Ideas, General Introduction to Pure Phenomenology. 12. Precisely this theorem of Descartes, incidentally, has its origin in the doctrine of categories in the Organon. 13 in Aristotle. Therefore, metaphysics is as tightly bound up with logic and epistemology as it was to be again at the height of Western philosophy, in Kant and Hegel. I should like to point out that this thesis includes something which is not said in as many words, but which is its origin here and forms part of the bedrock, if you will, of the whole of Western thought. We are all brought up so much within it that we take it for granted. It is truly like second nature to the mind. According to this doctrine, that thing is substantial, in the sense that it needs nothing else, which requires no means by which we can perceive it. It is, in other words, the immediate. Thus, at the beginning of Western metaphysics, stands the statement that on which everything is supported, on which everything depends and by which knowledge should be orientated, is the immediate in the form of the particular which Aristotle first equates with that which really and truly exists. However, at this point you must also be aware of a difference. For with a thinker as deeply connected to Western philosophy as Aristotle, it is especially important to differentiate historically, to avoid producing a general philosophical mush in which everything communicates with everything else. The immediacy implied in the basic doctrines of Aristotle that I have set out for you is not conceived by him, at least, not primarily, as the immediacy of sensory experience. It is not, therefore, an immediacy in relation to our capacity for knowledge. And it can be assumed that Aristotle, as a pupil of Plato, was acquainted with the critique of the immediacy of subjective sensory certainty in the Theaetetus, 14, and that he had assimilated it into his thought. His immediacy, therefore, is not an immediacy of consciousness, it is not single quotelli est in nes immediates de la conscience, 15, but, if one can put it so paradoxically, it is the immediate in itself. Here, of course, critical reflection is at once confronted with the question of how one can speak of immediacy in itself at all, since any such immediacy, about which something is predicated, can only be immediacy for a consciousness which predicates it. But, apart from that, I'd like to make another criticism here, not just for the sake of criticizing the historical thinker, since such an attempt would display a naivety which, I assume, you would not expect from me any more than from yourselves. I make it in order to show you that a theory like the one I am expounding leads to extraordinary difficulties within itself. For to introduce you to Aristotle's metaphysics cannot be simply to set out his main theses. It must give you an awareness of the problems of his metaphysics. And to do that is necessarily to point to the difficulties which are concealed beneath the plausibility of the argumentation. Now, Hegel taught that there is no immediacy which is not at the same time mediated. 16. If you accept that Hegel successfully proves this point, and I would think that there are few moments in Hegel's logic which are as obviously convincing as this proof. 17. It is no longer clear what the traditional metaphysical notion of substance, as that which absolutely requires no mediation, is supposed to mean. And it seems to me to be one of those curious anachronisms, not to say archaisms, which the history of philosophy, and especially of metaphysics, drags along with it, that while it engaged in the critical reflections on the concept of immediacy that I have just described, it did not perceive that the doctrine of substance, that is, the conception of substance as that which exists primarily and immediately in itself, was necessarily and profoundly affected by those reflections. If I were to say to you that philosophy has taken too little notice of this throughout its history, that would be unjust and incorrect. It has, of course, taken notice, in the form of radical nominalism, but it has not taken notice in its rationalist speculative idealist mainstream, if I may put it like that. It is certainly the case that Hume, who, if you like, represents the furthest logical conclusion to be drawn from Aristotle's doctrine of the reality of the particular, disintegrated the notion of substance for this very reason. That is to say that the concept of substance, at first inseparably bound up with the concept of the particular thing, gives way in his thought to a critique which states that the thing itself does not really exist, but only the habitual associations of subjective modes of appearance, which we then conventionally regard as things. In accordance with this, Kant turned the concept of substance into a subjective function, an activity, something which the mind produces within objects, and no longer the thing existing in itself which Aristotle terms substance qua thing. On the other hand, however, in his doctrine of ideas and, in general, in his conception of the mens intelligibilis, the intelligible world, the notion of substance in the old Aristotelian sense still prevails in Kant's thought. 18. You can see at this point how the logical conclusion later drawn from the doctrine, which begins with Aristotle, that full reality can only be attributed to particular things, resulted from an attitude which, as I said earlier, was foreign to Aristotle and to antiquity, the orientation towards the subject. Only when the doctrine of the reality and immediacy of the particular is combined with the conception that this immediacy is only an immediacy for the subject, is a thoroughgoing nominalism, of the kind I have just briefly illustrated by the example of Hume, possible. And, to put the matter negatively, that is also the reason why one cannot speak of nominalism in Aristotle, despite the incipient tendency towards it that I have indicated. How the matter might be stated positively, you will see in a moment. To put it quite simply, there is something naively realistic in the notion of substance as used by Aristotle, and you will only be able correctly to understand his metaphysics as a whole, something which is not easy for us today, if you do not see it in terms of our ubiquitous subjective reflection, but, to use an expression from scholasticism, in intentione recta. That means, to see it in terms of the immediate objectivity of the external world, and not in terms of mediation through the perceiving consciousness. This curious intersection between the doctrine of the reality of the particular and, at the same time, a naively outward-turned realism, is another necessary feature of the structures of Aristotle's thought. Now, the truly Aristotelian element, which constitutes the entire difficulty I have been speaking about, is the fact that, despite this fundamental postulate of the reality of the particular, and the assertion that only that is substantial which does not need anything else but exists immediately, he was very emphatically a philosopher of mediation. To understand how this idea or this cult of the immediate, of the existent in itself, is entwined in Aristotle's thought with the idea of universal mediation, is the fundamental problem in understanding the metaphysics, and I would ask you to concentrate on this problem. You will then see, to jump ahead, that the concept of mediation found in Aristotle is extraordinarily different from that which those with a Hegelian training, and there will be more than a few of them among you, understand by mediation. Here, too, I would repeat like a scholastic, distingo, I distinguish. You can only grasp the specific nature of Aristotle's approach if you distinguish very strictly what is meant by mediation, by middle, and by the intermediate in Aristotle from what they mean in the dialectic. For, to state this in advance, Aristotle was anything but a dialectical thinker, although he was at the same time a thinker of immediacy and a thinker of mediation. One might say, if I might give this a Hegelian twist, that the thesis of immediacy and the thesis of mediateness were themselves not mediated in his work, if you will allow me to make a dialectical point at this juncture. Of course, this was not such a crucial issue for Aristotle, since the dialectic did not exist at that time, so that he could not distance or differentiate his method from it in the way I have just done. Rather, it is in keeping with the whole temper of Aristotle's philosophy, which is one of limitation, of respect, of moderation, of peccaris, that he softens and limits the doctrine of substantiality as immediacy by introducing the idea of improper or secondary substances, which he calls seripeovolat, second substances. One might also refer to them, perhaps, as second essences, although the word second clearly indicates that they are not pure immediacies but products of abstraction. They are second because they only come into being on the basis of what is given primarily, particular things. These deriparovoyat, these secondary or improper substances, cannot be hypostatized, as one would say in modern philosophical terminology, but are contained in particular things. They are thus immanent and not transcendent. And this thesis, that although on the one hand substantial concepts exist, they are not spes, they do not have their being beyond individual existing things, but are only embodied in them and are immanent to them, is really the basic thesis of the whole of Aristotle's metaphysics. It is the source of the fundamental difference between this philosophy and Plato's, its dynamic character. For if these devripatovjit are immanent in particular things, instead of standing opposed to them as something external and alien, it is no longer absurd or inconceivable, Aristotle argues, that these essences should have an effect on particular things, or that a mediation should be established between the idea and scattered existence. I should like to close with that remark, and will continue from this point in the next lecture. The 3rd of June 1965. In the last lecture I spoke about the seriparovaya, which can be translated as essences of second degree or second power. These cannot be posited as existing outside substances, or things, as the language of modern philosophy would make it appear. According to Aristotle, they cannot be hypostarized, but are immanent in substances, and not, like the Platonic ideas, transcendent. I also pointed out that a problem which really is hardly comprehensible in terms of the Platonic doctrine of ideas is at least prefigured in this aspect of Aristotle. It is the question of how one is to conceive the mediation between the world of ideas and the world of sensible objects, or, in Kantian terms, the mediation between the noumena and the phenomena. I should like to express this very cautiously, as the ideas, now, are no longer exopes, that is, they are no longer separated from the sensory, from objects, from the stuff of knowledge, but are realized only insofar as they are in these existent things. And the problem of causation, of the primary cause, which I mentioned as one of the problems from which metaphysics itself starts out, One is solved in principle in Aristotle's Metaphysics by the fact that this world of sensible appearance is teleologically orientated towards these ideas or pure possibilities, which are supposed to be contained within them. In Aristotle there is an expression for this relationship of the ideas or possibilities to the existent, Eve, to, that is to say, the one and the many. You can see here the perspective from which I view everything I have to tell you now about Aristotle's Metaphysics. In this perspective, the themes I have just mentioned persist throughout the whole of Western metaphysics. As in the game of Mooble, the pieces are already on the board in Aristotle's Metaphysics. In the later phases of metaphysical thinking they are pushed about a good deal and then, finally, as in the end game in Mooble, they start to hop, in the form of irrationalism. For this reason, the expression one and the many is of a special interest, and I bring this term to your attention because it recurs in almost exactly the same form in Kantian philosophy, at the point where the synthesis formed by the mind, which according to Kant is the act of cognition, or as cognition itself, is referred to as unity and diversity. 3. Aristotle's conception of the relationship of concept to individual existence, or, to put it in Aristotle's terms, of form to matter, really contains nothing other than such a unity and diversity. I should like to point out, incidentally, that exactly the same idea that I have just sketched also appears in the late Plato, and that it, not least, has given rise to the speculation I spoke of, for that Aristotle may possibly have had a retroactive influence on his teacher in his late period. In the Platonic dialogue Parmenides, which, in many respects, is the most enigmatic and peculiar structure in the whole corpus of Plato's work. In it the thesis is put forward that the one exists only as the unity of many, and that the many exist only as a manifold of units. This idea of the reciprocity, the interrelatedness of the universal and the particular, clearly had a powerful hold on the human mind at that point in its history. And in Aristotle it gave rise to the formulation I have just mentioned, which is especially important because this very idea of reciprocity, that on the one hand unity cannot exist independently of multiplicity, but, on the other, that multiplicity is only constituted by virtue of the one, this basic idea is already present in the formula of Aristotle that I have discussed. You can see, therefore, that the idea of unity and diversity, which in the history of modern philosophy has been transposed into the notion of the ordering subject through which this unity is produced, has its origin in ontology. That is, it stems from the fact that this unity is supposed to be the unity of being itself, which is prior to all the particular and individual things from which being is composed. This is so much the case that even the formula of unity and diversity is itself to be found in as many words in the Greek philosophers, so much is the whole of Western thinking enthralled to this tradition. And it might not be entirely idle to wonder whether this whole way of thinking has been subjected, through the influence of this idea, to a kind of channeling, which has forced everything in a quite specific, very compelling but also restrictive direction. And whether what we in later times have come to see as the rigor of ancient philosophy, or of philosophy in general, could be traced back to this narrowing of the Greek tradition to the relationship of the universal to the particular. Now, in Aristotle, and this is the fulcrum of his metaphysics, the point you need to understand if you want to grasp this highly peculiar and self-contradictory structure, the universal or form is, just as it was for his teacher Plato, the higher reality. In this doctrine, therefore, what I said in the last lecture with regard to the reality of the immediate is found to be stood on its head. Whereas, as it seems to me, the particular thing, or, as it is called in Aristotle, the tod ti, was first regarded as the only reality or true being, now, on the contrary, the form is the higher reality. I shall write this concept of road route on the blackboard. This concept, too, is fundamental to the whole of Western thought since all references to facticity, to that which cannot be dissolved in concepts and yet for which a conceptual name is sought, originate in this word tod tl. Tod tl, and this is very interesting with regard to the whole temper of Aristotle's thinking, is not really a concept at all, but a gesture. Tod t amounts to this, and points to something. And Aristotle realized that a concept for this, by its nature, non-conceptual thing could not actually be formed, that it could only be expressed by a gesture, whereas later this gesture became a term, which was finally precipitated in concepts such as a given, a datum, in scholasticism hux idas, or whatever such terms might be. I would now draw your attention to a major shift which took place in philosophical terminology at this point, and from which you can see the specific quality of Aristotle's metaphysics from a different side. For what in Plato was called the idea and as such was something absolute, existing in itself, is now suddenly called form. In place of the opposition between the true being of the world of the idea and the non-being of the world of sensible diversity, we now have the difference between form and matter. I shall write these two terms on the blackboard as well, as we shall have to use them constantly. Form means much the same as the modern term Gestalt in the narrower sense. In Latin it was translated as forma. The Greek word is papon, familiar to all of you from words such as morphology. The word for matter, that to which this form relates, is ve, translated into Latin as materia. I said that this transformation of terminology, which, in place of the traditional Platonic terms la e and eldos, on the one hand, and re of ze, on the other, now talks of pulsion d, has fundamental implications for the subject matter itself. You can see this quite clearly from the fact that when we speak of form, this term always contains a reference to something of which the entity in question is the form. The concept of form, therefore, is never a self-sufficient, autosemantic concept such as that of essence. Moreover, at this point Aristotle's terminology is still at a watershed. The terms Platon and eldos, Plato's term, still alternate. The term eidos, used in Plato's sense, still exists for Aristotle. And, conversely, van, matter, as the quintessence of everything which is taught here, and is therefore matter, cannot be conceived as something which does not also have form. The very choice of these reciprocal, interrelated terms, which reflect the real themes of Aristotle's metaphysics, therefore shows this philosophy to be as I have characterized it, an essentially mediating theory. This notion of form is the force immanent in van, matter. This concept of the immanent idea, which at the same time is the power center which moves matter, is a decisive concept in Aristotle's metaphysics. It is a concept which in our world has survived as another word for force, the concept of ethera, energy. Now, standing opposed to this energy, as realized form, is the concept of suvapuis, which refers to pure possibility. However, in Aristotle this pure possibility is that which is not yet formed, or is only now being formed. Possibility for him is really what we call matter, and the term which Aristotle's metaphysics uses for it is suvis. Around the relationship between these two moments, as we would call them today, around this relationship the whole of Aristotle's metaphysics revolves. 5. This, I believe, is the point where I may be able to clarify most vividly the difference between the whole of ancient metaphysics and what it has become. For, at first sight, once seen from the standpoint of the more recent Western tradition, there is something uncommonly paradoxical in the ideas I have just expounded, and I am not sure whether you have all grasped this paradox fully. Moreover, when expounding bodies of thought remote from us in time, I regard it as a duty to make the differences at least as clear as the identities. And these bodies of thought, despite the tradition or, one might almost say, because of it, include the work of Aristotle. I believe that to perceive the essence of historical phenomena and, above all, of phenomena of intellectual history, it is necessary not only to empathize with them or, to use that dreadful expression, to bring them close to us. Indeed, that generally has the opposite effect. The actuality of such concepts, and their true depth, can only be apprehended by first placing them at a distance, in order to make us aware both of the constitutive nature of history and of the wholly different conceptions which this procedure obliges us to form, especially with regard to matters which we have always thought we already knew, which were as familiar to us as if they came from our own childhood, yet which, looked at more closely, turn out to be quite different. Anyone who, as a European, has had sudden, surprising contact with Indian phenomena will be able to understand this double effect of closeness and extreme, alien distance. To clarify what I mean with regard to Aristotle, for us it is generally the case, when we speak of possibility, that we think of form, pictured as a form which is not your found content, whereas, when we speak of reality, we mean essentially that which is filled by sensible material. Look, for example, at the definitions of possibility, reality and necessity in the postulates of empirical thought in general in the Critique of Pure Reason. 6. For a fundamentally ontological mode of thinking like that of Aristotle, which still gives precedence to the form or the idea, this conception of possibility, though self-evident to us, looks like the exact opposite. I think you need to be aware of this difference if you were to understand what stands at the beginning of metaphysics and has dominated it ever since. For it is precisely the notion that the idea or the noumenal, the intelligible sphere, is more real than the empirical, which really forms the core of the metaphysical tradition. And only if you are aware, from the outset, of this paradoxical quality inherent in all metaphysics, will metaphysics cease to be an innocuous subject and reveal the difficult, demanding side which you need to experience if you want to have a sense of what metaphysics really means. In Aristotle, therefore, in keeping with the idea that the deutepat of the second essences, have a higher reality than the first, it is the case that ethera, which is form insofar as it is realized in matter, represents the higher, more substantial reality, just because it is form. In this respect Aristotle is, again, a Platonic thinker. Matter, by contrast, which for us is precisely the moment which decides the degree of reality, as that which is given by intuition, is demoted in this philosophy to mere possibility. To state the position paradoxically, reality in Aristotle's philosophy corresponds to what we call possibility, and possibility to what we call reality. You can only gain access to his philosophy if you first perform this inversion. You will, moreover, have little difficulty in recognizing once again, in this position of Aristotle's, the Platonic motif that the world of the ideas is more real than the world of the merely existent. The difference is that in Aristotle these two spheres no longer simply diverge, but an attempt is made, and I stress, an attempt, to bring them together. To the extent, therefore, that Evapia confers a higher order of reality than Suvos, to the extent far for Aristotle matter becomes mere possibility, he is the opposite of what he appears at the first level of his thought, which I presented to you in the last lecture. For in this respect he is a realist in the medieval sense, who teaches the precedence of universals over individual things, and not a nominalist. This must be emphasized strongly, for if one simply includes him among the nominalists on the grounds that, historically, two nominalist developments branched off from his thought, one entirely misunderstands the nature of his metaphysics. I recall that the late Alfred Weber, at the Sociologists' Conference in Heidelberg, it must have been in 1954, read a paper in which he referred to Aristotle without further ado as a nominalist, on the grounds I set out for you in the last lecture. And when, seeking save the honor of the history of philosophy and reluctant to let pass anything which flew so directly in the face of facts, I sketched for him some of the ideas I have expounded today, the nonagenarian scholar grew quite angry and never spoke to me again. But I cannot help it. To understand Aristotle means to recognize that both these moments are contained in his work, and that the conflict between them is resolved by giving precedence to the universal concepts or forms. It might be said, as Herr Hogg formulated it recently, that the contradictions and difficulties in which Aristotle gets caught up here really contain in latent form the whole problematic history of ontology, as the history of the relation of the universal to the particular, or of possibility to reality. I would also say that in Aristotle the relation of the universal to the particular is equated to that of possibility to reality. This, too, is a crucial aspect of his metaphysics. And this equation is carried out by attributing a higher order of reality to embodied essence than to matter, which now is mere possibility, because it has not yet found its form. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this leads on to a basic inconsistency to which I must draw your attention. I do this, as I have said, not because I regard it as either possible or timely to criticize Aristotle as one would a modern thinker. That seems to me a foolish and anachronistic procedure. I do so because I wish to make you aware of the imminent problems and the inherent dynamic of this first sketch of a metaphysics, which then led on to metaphysics in general. The first thing to be said is that Aristotle, who undoubtedly possessed the most extraordinary powers of thought, despite being without the experiences of the more than 2,000 intervening years, must himself have been aware of these problems. The question raised by his work is, quite simply, how is it possible that a philosopher who attached such enormous weight to the concept of the first cause, could, on the one hand, maintain that the only reality was the immediate, the Todd 71, but then, on the other, could regard the mediated, the concept realized and formed in matter, as the higher reality? The answer given by Aristotle has also become a canonical theme of the whole of subsequent Western metaphysics. It is based, quite simply, on the distinction between genesis and validity. 11. According to Aristotle, it is simply the case that for us what is primarily given, and to that extent is absolutely certain, is to 71, the immediate, but that in itself the higher is purport or eldos, the idea. A distinction is therefore drawn between the path followed by knowledge in its development towards its concept, and the truth content of that knowledge, as it is in and for itself. And these two moments are placed by Aristotle in a simple, unresolved opposition, without any attempt to reconcile them. Instead, he is content, somewhat mechanically, I would say, to create departments. On one side, the procedural department, how do we arrive at knowledge? What exists first for us? And on the other, the ontological or speculative department, how is the order of a sensus constituted in itself? I would point out that this Aristotelian procedure, too, has had highly peculiar consequences, continuing right up to contemporary philosophy. Max Scheler, who taught at this university for the last part of his life, took over this same Aristotelian doctrine, which was mediated to him through medieval scholasticism. His late metaphysics, especially, is based essentially on the separation he made, as if by an abyss of meaning, between the moment of Genesis, the way in which we become conscious of structures or senses or whatever they may be, and the validity of ideas in themselves. 13. And underlying Husserl's thinking in the Prolegomena to Pure Logic, the first volume of Logical Investigations, which was really the source of the entire reawakening of ontology, is the basic idea to be found in Aristotle, which I have just set out for you, that Genesis, how I arrive psychologically at logical propositions, has absolutely nothing to do with the validity, that is, the truth or untruth, of the purely logical or mathematical propositions in themselves. 14. Moreover, the tradition leading to this, being the scholastic tradition, goes back to Aristotle. Er's main carriers in the 19th century were Bernard Bolzano and Franz Brentano. The latter was Husserl's teacher. There is at this point, therefore, a direct link to Aristotelianism. Genetically, therefore, in terms of the advance of knowledge, what is immediate and sensibly certain is primary, according to Aristotle. In terms of validity, that is, objectively, the universal comes first. This state of affairs becomes even more peculiar and paradoxical in that Aristotle follows Plato in giving primacy to what comes first temporally, as that which we prize and rank highest, much as, in a feudal social order, the older family is the finer it considers itself to be. Aristotle took over this idea of the higher rank of what came first in the most emphatic way, so that it is hard to see how the Suripa of Oya, the second essence, the result of a process of abstraction and therefore something which came later, should suddenly be ranked higher. One single quote I should like to read out the passage from Bucca in which he argues that we always value the first and oldest thing higher, because I believe it is pivotal to what I understand generally by the term prima philosophia, or, which Aristotle expressly held metaphysics to be. This notion of a first philosophy clearly implies the same primacy of what comes temporally first, and you may detect the peculiarly paradoxical nature of Aristotelian thought, to which I want to draw your attention today, quite simply in the congealed form of the terminology. I mentioned that for him, or for the Scholius who gave the book its title, metaphysics meant that which follows after the doctrine of physical nature. It is, that is, the mediated, the secondary, which, therefore, is already presupposed by being. Now, however, metaphysics is supposed to be the first philosophy, the doctrine on which all else depends. I should therefore like to read you this passage from Bucca, relating to Thales. Bucca, by the way, describes essentially the prehistory of metaphysical speculation up to Aristotle's own work, and as such is still one of the most important sources on the history of Greek philosophy. The passage comes from section 983b, and reads as follows. It has, indeed, been suggested that the very earliest thinkers, long before Thales, held the same view of primary substance. He is probably thinking of Hesiod here. For they made Oceanus and Tethys the parents of generation and spoke of the gods as swearing by water, which they called Styx. For what is oldest is honored most, but the witness under oath is honored most of all. 16. The witness is honored because it is he who authenticates the oldest thing, so that in this sense everything depends on him. Here, therefore, is Aristotle's explicit formulation, which, in the Metaphysics, is to be found in all the passages, in which everything that has not evolved or become what it is, and is therefore the oldest thing, which has always existed, is regarded as the condition of the possibility of any becoming, an idea taken over directly from Aristotle by Hegel, and in which the final cause, that is, the divinity, is seen as the unmoved mover of all things. Aristotle's famous formulation of this doctrine of the unmoved mover is akiviro kuvuv. 17. In this conception, therefore, as in the relation of genesis to validity, Aristotle is inconsistent with regard to primacy, attributing it sometimes to Todd 71 and sometimes to Eldos. Inevitably, purely on the basis of this imminent contradiction, this doctrine proved unsatisfactory 18 and thus provided the motivation for the whole subsequent history of metaphysics. If the primary, and not by accident is the primary something material, in this case water, as it also was for Thales, on whom Aristotle bases his argument here, is to be ranked higher in the ontological sense, or regarded as the more original entity, as modern ontology might express it, one cannot conceive how the secondary, the derivative, the result of abstraction, can now be ranked higher. 19. Conversely, however, it is equally hard to concede why the sensibly certain, in its fortuitousness and individual restrictedness, as expressed in Todd TL, in the infantile language of that there, can be regarded as the highest thing, the foundation of all knowledge. And it can be said that this aporia, between the higher rank awarded on the one hand to the most abstract categorical determinants, or, in extreme terms, the pure logic, and, on the other, to the pure immediacy of that which is given her can now, this aporia has been a constant theme of metaphysics. However, if one takes seriously the idea of mediation, which is sketch 20 but not fully worked out in Aristotle, the idea that form and matter are really moments which can only be conceived in relation to each other, the question as to which of them comes absolutely first or is ranked absolutely higher becomes transparent as a false abstraction. And one will then trace the forms of the concrete mediation of these moments, instead of treating the product of abstraction which keeps them apart as the only rightful source of truth. That, really, is the connecting thread which, in my opinion, leads from Aristotle's metaphysics as a whole to the questions currently occupying the minds of philosophers in this field. The 15th of June 1965. Ladies and gentlemen, I shall continue where I left off before the Whitsun holidays, in the middle of my discussion of Aristotle's metaphysics. You may perhaps recall that I said last that the modern problem of the relation of genesis to validity was also posed by Aristotle. On the one hand he argued that what is immediately given, was absolutely primary, while on the other he established a spiritual or mental hierarchy in which ideas, or forms, as he called them, were given that status. 1. I should like to draw your attention to a paradox which seems to me extremely characteristic of the whole history of metaphysics, and which is sketched as a kind of prototype in Aristotle's Metaphysics. There are two predominant conceptions of apxi, or TP@TOV, running through the whole history of philosophy. On one side is the idea that what is directly given, the immediate facts of consciousness, should be posited as primary. From the connections between them, the subjectively orientated form of epistemology sought to construct the quintessence of that which is. On the other side, however, primary status is given to the pure concept, which always stands at the origin of rationalistic versions of epistemology. Epistemology has worn itself out trying to reconcile these two notions of the primary, which exclude each other, so that you might have reason to doubt the validity of the whole approach which posits some absolutely primary thing. 2. According to Adam Rees, an exponent of simple traditional logic, it is clear that both of them cannot be primary. Nevertheless, these two approaches, which historically gave rise to the antithesis between empiricism and rationalism, have always had a good deal to say for themselves. The various empiricist tendencies have maintained that they go back to something given which is not mediated by anything else and of which one can be certain beyond doubt. The other tendencies, which started out from the pure concept as the absolutely primary, can claim that, compared to the purity of the mental entity, its sensible content is either something transient and changing, or even, as the Platonic tradition holds, is actually deceptive. The exclusivity of both moments is untenable, since both can be refuted by simply asking, which of them is absolutely primary? The only possible answer is that each of these principles, if I can call them that, always implies the other, or that, in Hegel's language, the two principles are mediated by each other. I should add here that to call them principles is an improper use of language, since in the strict sense one can only speak of principles rationalistically, when dealing with purely mental entities, whereas what is immediately given, which ultimately means sensations, is something non-conceptual and therefore cannot be a principle. But you may be able to recognize here something of the mystère de la philosophie, in the fact that even this non-conceptual element, this non-principle, which nevertheless is constitutive of, and inherent in, all philosophy, cannot appear within that realm, which, heaven knows, can only operate with concepts, except in the form of a concept. It is therefore not merely a piece of terminological pedantry to say that philosophy, through its very form, contains a prejudgment in favor of principles. That means, in general, that if we want to give primacy to the sensible moments of knowledge we cannot simply, so to speak, put forward green as a given entity, or we can do so, but it won't take us far philosophically. We shall immediately have to abstract from what is given by the senses and thus, even when operating at this opposite pole, are already moving within the same conceptual language which is located at what I might perhaps call the rationalistic pole. For this consideration, that both these mutually exclusive approaches which postulate something certain and primary are untenable, leads on, as a consequence, to what I have called mediation. And, to repeat the point, it was Aristotle's immeasurable innovation in philosophy to have been the first to be aware of this problem of mediation. Both the difficulty of understanding his work, and the criticism to which it is open, stem precisely from the fact that one must both grasp the meaning of the term mediation as he created it, and understand why the concept of mediation failed in his work. To say that it failed may sound schoolmasterly, but unfortunately, if one takes an idea seriously, one has little alternative. I also wanted to point out that a very up-to-date problem is called behind this two-pronged approach of Aristotle's, which posits the sensibly certain as primary for us, and the pure forms as primary in themselves, that is, metaphysically primary as the pure movers of everything that is. It is the question whether the genesis of concepts can indeed be separated from their truth content, as happens whenever genesis and validity, or the primary for us and the primary in itself, are kept apart, as is the case in Aristotle's Metaphysics. This gives central access to what is called the problem of ideology, since the question raised by the latter is indeed whether the objective truth of propositions and concepts is fundamentally independent of their origin. I cannot set out here the entire problematic of the theory of ideology. 5. I can only sketch the connection between the problem of ideology and that of epistemology, which concerns us at present. In the case of ideology, too, it is extremely difficult to come to a simple yes or no decision, just as, in general, it seems to me that the work of philosophy, which is essentially one of differentiation, cures us of the habit of demanding simple alternatives of yes or no where the subject we are reflecting on may perhaps allow neither alternative. In the course of philosophical work one becomes aware that insist on knowing is it such or is it such, has something infantile about it, and if there is any such thing as an educative value of philosophy, it may lie in the fact that it weans us from that kind of naivety. So, to return to our subject, to reduce knowledge to its genesis is a bit like arguing that the validity of mathematical propositions should depend on the conditions under which mathematics came into being socially, or even on the psychological conditions under which mathematical or logical judgments are made. That, clearly, is nonsense. To that extent, the separation of genesis and validity undoubtedly has some justification, and it is the very great merit of Edmund Husserl to have been the first to draw attention emphatically to this point as early as the 1890s. 6. On the other hand, if one simply separates knowledge from its genesis, if, in other words, one ignores the sedimented history contained in any piece of knowledge, a part of the truth is also lost. Truth is then pinned down to a claim of timelessness, which itself depends on something taking place within time, the process of abstraction which disregards temporal moments. There is in this context, therefore, a very central problem of how these possibilities are related to each other. I shall not dwell on the question whether this is a metaphysical or an epistemological problem. Such distinctions, in any case, are difficult to maintain in concrete cases. I would only repeat that while the truth content of knowledge or of a proposition certainly cannot be reduced simply to the way in which it has come about, nor can its genesis be disregarded in the truly dictatorial manner advocated by Max Scheler, for example, with, in some cases, the absurd consequence that a number of concepts which undoubtedly have their origin in social conflicts are nevertheless supposed to have an intrinsic validity which has absolutely nothing to do with these conflicts. 7. This whole tangle of problems, too, like, one might say, the whole problematic of philosophy, has its origin in the work of Aristotle. I would add, in order to avoid stopping short at this point with the question, that the genetic moments are not, as it seems to vulgar prejudice, simply external to knowledge, but are inherent in the character of validity itself. This takes us back to the idea of mediation. One might formulate the matter by saying that truth has a temporal core, or, as Husserl, who turned his attention to this problem in his late phase, expressed it, that even in its subjectivity truth also has an implied genetic meaning. 9. Moreover, this problem also occurs in Kant, where, on the one hand, synthetic judgments are supposed to be timelessly valid a priori, yet, on the other, are constituted by the spontaneous activity of consciousness, and thus, finally, by the work of the mind. So that something supposedly timeless has a temporal moment as the condition of its possibility. That seems to me to be the only possible answer to this question. I shall just take this opportunity to point out that you can really seconds here, from a central position in philosophy, how deeply sociology and philosophy are interrelated, and how little the transition from one to the other is a mere. This is simply because, if it is realized that the moment of the origin or the temporal genesis of knowledge, with all the temporality it involves, is inherent in the character of truth, is not external to it in the manner of truths which change with time, but founds the character of truth itself, then it is no longer possible to perform the absolute separation between the question of the social origin or the social history of an idea and its truth content in the manner required by the usual scientific division of labor. Nor does this amount to a sociologization of philosophy. Rather, sociological problems are immanent in philosophical ones, and immanently philosophical reflection leads necessarily to these problems. This approach, incidentally, is radically different from that of the sociology of knowledge, which confuses the origin of knowledge with its truth content in a merely external sense, but this, too, I can touch on only briefly here. Given, and of the idea? And why does he accept so relatively lightly the resulting contradictions and difficulties, some of which I have sketched for you? The central contradiction, to return to the specific problematic of Aristotle's work, is that, on the one hand, the idea is supposed to be only immanent, only mediated, only something inherent in an existent and not transcendent with regard to it, yet, on the other, it is made into something which is being in itself. Expressed in these bald terms, this is a contradiction which is very difficult to resolve. We arrive here at the point where the intellectual achievement of Aristotle has to be defined, as well as the historical position occupied by a thinker who can be described as the ancestor of bourgeois thinking and at the same time as a pupil of Plato. He raised the question of the mediation between the universal and the particular as no philosopher had done before him, and he was fully aware of this achievement. And if you read Aristotle, most of what he has to say about earlier thinkers sounds, well, a little benevolent and patronizing, as one writes about half-savages. He has what I might almost call a splendid academic arrogance, which colors the whole round of what he writes about those earlier thinkers who lacked the precise knowledge available to him. This is highly characteristic of the temper of his thought. Thus, he raised the question, but did not solve it. The true core of the problematic of Aristotle's work is that he, unlike Plato, posed the problem of mediation with extreme clarity, but, nevertheless, did not achieve mediation. And co-understand how these two things are connected is the true task presented by his work, and thus is the task facing the traditional approach of Western philosophy. For he conceives the relation between the categories of form and matter, which is central to his metaphysics, as an external relation, although they are interdependent in his work. That is to say that he understands the existent as composed additively of form and matter. And for this reason the two categories, although neither can exist without the other, appear as absolutely separate, instead of being perceived as abstractions which only designate moments, neither of which can be thought independently of its opposite, and both of which need the other through their very concepts. To put this paradoxically, one might say that in Aristotle mediation is not itself mediated. That while he recognized that neither moment could exist without the other, he saw this interrelatedness almost as a quantitative agglomeration. He saw it additively, as a conjunction of these two moments, which could not be kept apart in chemical purity, as it were, yet were not dependent on each other in terms of their meaning and constitution. That is the point he reached, and his critique of Plato, which I have expounded for you, has proved as much. It might be said that in the metaphysics, and not only there but in the whole of his philosophy, especially the ethics and theory of the state, Aristotle was a mediating thinker. He was a mediating thinker in the sense that his concern was always to find an intermediate position between two extremes, so that existence is to be understood here as a middle term between form and matter. But this mediation is really only something existing between the extremes, and not that which is implicit in the meaning of the extremes and is accomplished through the extremes themselves. If you will permit me this anachronistic horror, I would say that he is the mediating thinker par excellence, yet one lacking the idea of the dialectic. In his work the extremes are not themselves mediated, but only something intermediate between them, as is in keeping with the overall principle of this philosophy, the ideal of which is the happy medium, or the peccaris. This principle of the happy medium, of moderation between the extremes, is thus a central problem. As it is taught in the Ethics, 11 and the Politics, this moderation is transposed, as it were, into the absolute, and that being is presented as something like the happy medium between form and matter, though with a heavy emphasis on form. I would only add that in this non-dialectical conception of mediation Aristotle was a true Platonist, since precisely this manner of defining concepts as the happy medium between their extremes is a schema which constantly underlies the argumentation in the Platonic dialogues. When, for example, Plato defines courage, in an elaborate procedure, as the happy medium between reckless daring on one side and cowardice on the other, 12 that is precisely in keeping with this climate of thought. You may think that I am demanding an awful lot of subtlety from you at this point. Having identified something mediated, which cannot be dissolved with chemical purity into either side, so to speak, but links them both, I then distinguish further whether this both is only a chemical mixture, to use the terms of natural science, or a genuine compound. But I have to tell you that, as you will find confirmed again and again if you study philosophy in any depth, the so-called large philosophical questions are regularly decided by such subtleties, such questions of detail. For example, the overall question whether some such thing as a first philosophy, or the dissolution of philosophy into its principles, is possible, or whether it cannot be done, since each first principle postulates the other within itself. By virtue of its own meaning, this question really depends on how one stands with regard to such subtlety. If I said earlier that I was chaving in a somewhat schoolmasterly manner in criticizing Aristotle on this point, I should like to correct that now, for it is here that the historical coefficient really enters the argumentation I have just mentioned. The moment of dialectical mediation, by which a strongly philosophical concept is dependent, through its own meaning, on the non-conceptual, from which it has been abstracted. 13. This moment only became thinkable, and this is not just a facile a priori interpretation made post festum, but one that withstands proper scrutiny. Thought had passed through substantial subjective reflection. That is, once it had been realized that categories, such as those of form and matter used here, are themselves abstractions produced by the mind. They cannot, therefore, be posited in their immediacy as absolute, but can only be operated, as Hegel would put it, as something already posited. This discovery of subjectivity as the constitutive element of knowledge was entirely foreign to antiquity. Even where subjective modes of speech appear in antiquity, which is not seldom, we should not confuse them with modern ones, since they are applied there to an individual, personal relativism. That is, the validity of knowledge is related to the particular constitutions of individual Kapok. But the question that has given such force to the concept of subjectivity in the history of modern philosophy, the question whether subjectivity actually conditions or constitutes truth and objectivity, is alien to the whole of ancient philosophy. And if it is true that correspondences with past intellectual formations can only be recognized if one places them at a distance, rather than rejoicing that they are just the same as ours, that is precisely the reason why Aristotle's thought, which in Intentione Erecta, fundamentally, is orientated towards the concept of substance, and as yet has no conception of self-reflection, was unable, for that very reason, to grasp the concept of the dialectic. I would only add that, in the above remarks, the last word has not been said on the problem of the dialectic. It would be a misunderstanding to conclude from what I have said that the conception of a dialectical philosophy is essentially and always subjective. There are further reflections on reflection, by which this subjective reduction is itself surpassed and negated. I say this only so that you do not believe that I wanted here to advocate simply a subjective idealist kind of thinking instead of the ancient ontological one. That is far from my intention. I only wanted to show that a dialectical understanding of the basic concepts of metaphysics, with which Aristotle is concerned, is simply not possible unless reflection on subjectivity has advanced much further than it had in his thought. I would also note that, through Aristotle's peculiarly additive doctrine, the concept of matter is extremely dematerialized, is turned into something very indefinite and general. And since, as I have just said, subjective reflection had not yet taken place in Aristotle, it is all the more surprising how far his thought agrees in very fundamental moments with later idealist thinking, which does perform this subjective reflection. If it is the case that all determinants, all that which makes something what it is, really stem from its form, and if, by contrast, matter is really something quite indefinite, quite abstract, then we have already, in the midst of this pre-subjective, ontological thinking, a precise sketch of the later idealist doctrine according to which the matter of cognition is absolutely indeterminate, receiving all its determinants and thus all its content through form, that is, through subjectivity. 1.4. However, I should now define precisely how Aristotle differs from the whole of modern thought. In Aristotle's work, and he is again a Platonist in this, the concept of form is not yet equated with thought, with the function of the subject. Rather, form is, as it were, picked out by a mechanism of abstraction from the diversity of that which is, and above all from the diversity of what is formulated in language, and is then made into something existing in itself, instead of being identified as an operation of the subject. One might say, therefore, if I may speak anachronistically once more, that Aristotle's metaphysics is an idealism malgré lui-même. It has the same consequences. The qualification of its own matter, and thus the denigration of matter itself, which idealism was to have so emphatically later, but without having encompassed the medium of idealism as such. One is obliged to ask, therefore, what remains of matter in Aristotle, if all its determinants have been stripped away and attributed to form? What is left behind is an emptiness which is to be filled, and this idea that pure matter is something abstract and empty that has to be filled leads to the central doctrine of Aristotle's metaphysics, that matter is not a solid entity one can hold onto, but is just pure possibility, and that, by contrast, the real is actually form. In a certain sense this idea, too, recurs in idealism, in that reality is conceived as what is constituted by the subject, and matter as the indeterminate. But the remarkable thing, with which we really find it hard to empathize, is that this distinction is made from a naively realistic standpoint. What we believe we can hold in our hands as the most important thing of all is presented here as something quite indeterminate and empty, as the mere possibility of what might emerge from it, while the true reality is form. We, on the contrary, are accustomed to understand form as that through which something existent, a ti, or whatever you like to call it, must in some way be formed. This concept of possibility only exists in Aristotle, of course, because, although he says these two main principles, form and matter, as belonging together in some way, he nevertheless believes that they can be grasped as essences independent of each other, which, though interrelated, are not so interrelated that one is constituted by the other through its own nature. This problem, still unresolved in Aristotle, that matter is really an emptiness which only comes to exist through its own reflection, through its form, is not developed further until Hegel's logic, which likewise has an objective orientation. And I should like to close by pointing out, for those of you who are interested in Hegel, that the usual derivation of Hegel from German idealism reflects only one side of his work. On the other side, because of the objective orientation of Hegel's logic, constant reference must be made to Aristotelian logic, from which he took this idea, as has been demonstrated in detail in the work of the Oxford philosopher Geoffrey Muir, once to which I would draw your attention here. We shall continue from this point next week.